Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's Human Rights Oration, presented by the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission in partnership with RMIT University. My name is Kristen Hilton and I'm Victoria's Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner, and I'm so glad that you could join us for this very special conversation today. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining you, the Bunwarang people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their deep connection to the land and their ancient and beautiful culture from which we have much to learn. I pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from other communities who are here today. This is, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. Today is International Human Rights Day. It's a day when we celebrate the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 72 years ago, which saw a coming together of people from all across the world in the aftermath of the Holocaust. People who said, how did this happen? And never again. We must protect the rights of people to be free from discrimination, from violence and torture. We must enshrine in law the right to be treated with equality, respect and dignity, and we must protect our freedoms. We must understand that to value one another is our greatest safety, and to engage in fear and contempt, our greatest error. And in 2020, this hope and the laws that underpin it remain as important as ever. Because this year especially has shown us all that human rights matter, and the decisions that are made by governments on our behalf matter. They matter if you're an older person living in aged care. They matter if you're a person or a parent trying to educate a child with a disability from home because schools are closed. They matter if you're a person living in public housing that has been locked down without warning. They matter if you're told to stay home, but you have no home to go to. They matter if suddenly you can't participate in the activities, community, religious or family-based, that sustain you. And they matter because a virus is threatening your health and your economic security. This year has shown to us both the weaknesses and the strengths in our communities, our institutions and our systems, both here and in every country around the world. It's also provided us with an opportunity to pause and reflect. And if we are brave enough and if we care enough to begin to imagine and build a life after 2020 that is better than it was before. Over the last week, we've conducted our Equality Talk series presented in partnership with RMIT's University Social Innovation Hub. And this has provided some space for reflection and imagining. In our first event, our panel affirmed just how valuable Victoria's Charter of Human Rights has proven to be as we've navigated here in Victoria extraordinary circumstances that have sought to balance rights and restrictions. Here at the Equal Opportunity Commission, we saw a dramatic surge in interest in human rights, with a six-fold increase in inquiries from the community trying to understand human rights issues related to everything from mask wearing to participating in protest and living under curfew. We've used the Charter to advocate for the rights of those who already experience systemic inequality more harshly. But we've also heard and seen both organised and spontaneous acts of kindness and grace that have soothed and sustained us. And the individual experience has also been a collective one. One of the consequences of COVID-19 is that we've all become more invested in decisions that have been made about us. We've asked whose experience matters and which voices rise to the top. We've seen that you can't solve community problems unless you understand how people in the community experience the world differently. In our second Equality Talks event, New Frontiers, we heard about the importance of taking bold action on climate change, the need to protect and promote health by addressing socio-economic inequality and the conditions in which people study, work and live. We will learn to celebrate and learn from the resilience and leadership of our First Nations communities. We've heard a lot about resilience this year, and we've also seen vastly different styles of leadership across the world. And I can't think of a better person to have a conversation with on International Human Rights Day about resilience, recovery and leadership than the Honourable Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia and current chair of Beyond Blue. But before we kick off that conversation, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Martin Bean, Vice-Chancellor and President of RMIT University. Prior to joining RMIT, Martin served as the Vice-Chancellor of the Open University, the UK's largest academic institution and a global leader in the provision of flexible learning, which I expect has stood him in very good stead for this year. Martin has won numerous awards for his contribution to education, and in 2015, he was recognised in the United Kingdom's New Year's Honours List for services to higher education. Martin and I discussed briefly about the most nerve-wracking thing about today was the fact that both our mothers were watching. So before Martin joins us virtually, I'd like to say hello to his mum and welcome her to the conversation. And Martin, over to you.
There we go. Sorry about that. Looks like we had a bit of a false start there. Thank you, Kristen. My mum will be thrilled, and it's my absolute pleasure and privilege to be part of today's event. I'd like to pay my own respects to the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of our university, and respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present, and the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. My goodness, what a year it has been. 2020 began with large parts of Australia on fire and a deep sense of how suddenly a natural disaster can take hold. It surfaced issues of climate change and community resilience, and I'm proud to see that we rallied to support those affected. Then barely had the smoke cleared from the skies, then the coronavirus took over the news. Of course, for a while it felt far away and we were grateful. And then the COVID-19 pandemic took off, disrupting almost every aspect of life, challenging our institutions and disrupting our assumptions about the future. What transpired was a year of intense pressure, hardship, and suffering for people everywhere. And of course, the experience put institutions like RMIT and others under enormous pressure too. For us as a large organization serving many thousands of people, the challenges have been unprecedented. But from the start, we knew we had to support our staff, students, and communities work their way through their intensely personal and varied challenges. We had to help them survive, adapt, and navigate their way through. We had to continue to pursue our mission because the transformative power of education and world-class research was suddenly more critical than ever. And at the same time, we had to set ourselves up for a sustainable future because the goalposts for tertiary education in Australia were suddenly and dramatically shifted. And you know what? Through the extraordinary community that is RMIT, we did it. And I'll be forever grateful for our people and their support in 2020. When I reflect on this year, two aspects really stand out for me. First is the human impact of this crisis and the shared situation we faced and continue to face. Illness, unemployment, repeated lockdown, fear, mistrust, and the need to support well-being, resilience, and community like never before. The second is the systemic nature of the crisis and the way it revealed underlying problems and weaknesses in the systems around us, in our environment, digital infrastructure, welfare support and housing, medical innovation, and manufacturing. The pandemic also led to a renewed role for government and spurred every sector into working together in new ways to find responses and search for solutions. Treating all people with dignity and respect, being truly inclusive, and making sure that our legal institutions, governance systems, and democracy work for everyone. At the heart of our purpose as a public education institution is our promise to help people adapt to a changing world, generate new solutions, and ensure the opportunities of lifelong learning are open to as many people as possible. That's one reason why I'm delighted that RMIT's Social Innovation Hub and the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission have been working together for this Human Rights Week, and that we're involved in this wonderful oration with the Honourable Julie Gillard. Reimagining how the world could be and exploring how we can use new technologies, new insights, and new creative methods to shape it together goes hand in hand with the work of achieving inclusion and equality. Social innovation plays a vital role in this, along with partnership across the community. It's part of our practical response to supporting people through the pandemic, while we simultaneously pursue a better and more inclusive future. In the equality talks earlier this week, the conversation explored how we might pursue the right forms of accountability and freedom, community resilience and sustainability as we addressed the post-crisis environment. There's no shortage of imagination when it comes to creating a world after COVID-19 that is a better life than the one we had before. What we need from here is respect for each other, collaboration, and determination. It will require energy, commitment, and resilience from everybody, and that will not happen by accident. It will happen because of people like you. It's now my pleasure to step aside for our former Prime Minister and Chair of Beyond Blue, Julia Gillard, a passionate advocate for inclusion and opportunity and a champion of equality in Australia and the world. Julia is uniquely placed to speak to these issues. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Martin. And I'm now really delighted to introduce you to our special guest today, Julia Gillard. I remember I was in a cafe at the bottom of Victoria Legal Aid offices in Queen Street, watching the TV on the wall as it was announced that Julia Gillard would be the 27th Prime Minister of Australia and our country's first female Prime Minister. And I recall that as a pure moment of hope and possibility. I think there are very few pure moments in politics, but that felt like one of them. And during her time as PM, Julia Gillard led nation-changing policy reform of Australia's education system and healthcare. Her government established the first ever scheme for people with disabilities and addressed the gender pay gap for social and community sector workers. She also gave the best ever speech on misogyny, which has now been put to dance on TikTok, and since that time has gone on to be a much admired world leader for social change. She currently serves as the chair of Beyond Blue, one of Australia's leading mental health organisations. Julia is also chair of the Global Partnership for Education, an international funding body for education in developing countries, and the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College in London, which through research, practice and advocacy is addressing women's underrepresentation in leadership. Julia Gillard recently co-authored her second book, Women and Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons, and in her spare time, she hosts a brilliant podcast called A Podcast of One's Own, where she has conversations with fascinating women working in healthcare, politics, the arts and science. Julia Gillard, hello, and how lovely to be face-to-face with you, even virtually.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
So 2020 has been a bit of a whopper. And I understand that in lockdown, you did attempt a jigsaw puzzle, but I can't imagine how you would have got that finished with all the advocacy and engagement that you've been doing in 2020. How are you feeling as the year draws to a close?
Well, I have got through a few jigsaw puzzles. They are a good relief when you've been using this technology for a long period of time. But as the year draws to a close, I think I'm probably sharing with most people around the country a sense that it will be fantastic to get to Christmas and the new year. I think this has felt like a long, hard year for many, and we're eager to turn the page to 2021. And I feel too that there's a sense of lightening and optimism. People are conscious that the vaccine's coming, that science has done remarkable things to get it to us so quickly, and that consequently there could be some easier days ahead in terms of COVID-19. So a sense of weariness at this point, but with silver linings.
I don't know about you, but two of the phrases that I don't ever want to hear again is one, you're on mute, or the one that I just got sent via text, which is, Kristen, your video isn't on. And the other is that we are living in unprecedented times. But it does feel as though we're living through a real moment in history here. And I wanted to know whether or not you feel like there is a before 2020 or an after 2020, and whether you think some things will be changed forever, for good or for worse.
I agree with you. You're on mute is the phrase of the year. I wouldn't be surprised if that makes an entry in the Macquarie Dictionary or one of those when they do the updating. I do think that 2020 is one of the dividing lines. So as we talk about eras, you know, before the global financial crisis, after the global financial crisis, I think we will forever talk about before 2020 and after 2020. Exactly what difference 2020 is going to make to our long-term future, I think, is still in contest. You can see that people could take a number of positive lessons out of this and build on them for the future. And by positive lessons, I mean that we've all been reminded just how much government matters, and that it's very important for people to be engaged in their democracy and thoughtful about their political choices. We've been reminded about how much science and evidence matters. We've all spent this year hanging off every word from chief medical officers and the like, and we could take that with us. We could take with us too the re-evaluation I think we've all had about the value of caring work, that the people who actually got our society through this difficult time are in occupations that historically haven't been as valued as they should have been. And finally, I think we could take the best of this technology with us, which is not to, I don't think anybody of us will be hankering for the days when people were locked in and had no choice and were trying to homeschool at the same time and all the rest of it. But this technology does have the opportunity for many, not all, but for many occupations to change the way that people engage with work. I think that's the sort of positive view of the future. The negative view would be that this has turned nations inwards, that people have stopped looking broadly, that they've hunkered down, that they've wanted to protect themselves, their families, wanted to protect their nation. And there has been a sort of disengaging in many ways. And if that trend was to continue, I think it would be a negative one. I also think this re-evaluation of the importance of science could be in contest. We know that around the world there will be many inquiries into what happened with the pandemic, and I fear that in many places around the world, politicians will try and blame scientists, so that will put science in contest. And I think too that there will be, you know, very strong anti-vaccination movements, and that will push back against science and evidence. And I think this technology, which can be so empowering, can also end up, if it's forced on people in a work context, end up being disempowering and isolating. So whether we get that positive worldview or the more negative worldview, I think is for all of us to shape. You know, this is a time for activism as we define the future, beyond 2020, and what we remember that dividing line for.
And I think that's one of the things that we have seen, is that there has been more civic engagement. Even here in this country, I think we've been very largely compliant with lockdowns, but more and more people are interested in exactly what decisions are being made and the process of how those decisions are being made. You've been chair now Beyond Blue since 2017, which is Australia's most visited mental health organisation. And I know that even before 2020, the services that Beyond Blue offers were extremely stretched, and I expect that that increase has trebled or even more than that in the last year. And I expect that there are very few of us in this year who haven't felt anxious or overwhelmed or sad. And for those who are living with mental health conditions, isolation, economic insecurity, and health fears may have exacerbated those pre-existing conditions. How has Beyond Blue responded to the mental health challenge, and how have the community's needs evolved as the pandemic has progressed, as we have learnt that this is not something that's going to end in a month?
It's been a hugely pressurised year for Beyond Blue, and I do want to pay tribute to all of the staff of Beyond Blue. They are Victorian based, so at a time when they needed to surge what they were doing in the interests of the community as individuals, they were experiencing all the stresses and strains of lockdown. So to give you a sense of how we've experienced the year, of course, we started with bushfires, and Beyond Blue was already seeing a surge in demands from bushfire affected communities, but also from Australians generally, who found that a very anxious time as they watched night after night as our country was under such stress and strain. And then at the start of the pandemic, quite quickly, we saw even more Australians coming to Beyond Blue. The number of people engaged in the thread that we put up around the coronavirus was quickly 7 times the level of the numbers who had been engaged in discussions about the bushfires. The Australian government did respond by giving us funding to create a coronavirus wellbeing support service, and remarkably, the staff at Beyond Blue got that launched 8 days after the Prime Minister announced funding. So it was a truly incredible effort. That has included a website, it's included peer exchange and a telephone support line. We've had 1 million Australians visit the website, 1.5 million engaged in the peer support end, and the calls to the coronavirus support line, plus our normal Beyond Blue support line, where you ring and you speak to a mental health professional. Our call volumes, if you do the month on month compared with last year, have been 30% up, 50% up, 60% up, depending on which phase we've been in with lockdowns and stresses and strains. You wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that disproportionately that demand has come from Victoria, given the circumstances there. What people have reported has sort of evolved over time. Initially, people were reporting fear, anxiety, concern about their own health, about the health of family members. And then as the weeks went on, the economic pressures started to come more to the fore and be reported by people as they engaged with those support services. During the time of Victoria's lockdown, there was a lot of concern from Victorians about stigma, about other parts of the country looking down on them, about the, how pressing it felt that you in Victoria was so locked in, but you could get on your television or online and see people in other states living comparatively normal lives, that sort of exacerbated how people were feeling. And now as the year has gone through, there is a sense of exhaustion and fatigue. So we do know that people's, mental health needs are continuing to evolve as the pandemic goes through its various stages. We are very mindful that the research and evidence from earlier crises tells us that often the biggest mental health pressures can happen after the urgency of the crisis has receded. We know, for example, that in bushfire affected communities, when everybody's there and there are evacuation centres and there are TV cameras and everybody's talking about it and everybody's sending things to support bushfire affected communities, it's often not in that moment but several months later, when everybody else's life seems to have moved on, but yours hasn't, that people can feel the greatest mental health effects. And we're very conscious that we could go through a similar cycle with the pandemic, that it could be, later in 2021, when many people's lives look like they've returned to normal, that people who are still under acute economic pressure from the crisis are feeling the greatest effects.
So given that, and given that we don't know what the long-term mental health impacts of the crisis are going to be, how does an organisation like Beyond Blue plan for that? And how do you take into account all the different community needs, whether that's people living regionally, young people who might feel a real sense of loss of hope and disruption, or people, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people? How do you take into account all of those different community needs without really knowing what the picture might look like in the next couple of years?
Yes, we've had plenty of practice, and we've certainly tested ourselves this year. And we want to be there Beyond Blue for everyone. And so we do spend a lot of time thinking about how our resources can be tailored to meet the needs of different age ranges and different sorts of communities within Australia. But having said that, we also very much think of ourselves as part of the nation's mental health ecosystem, and we seek to have partnerships and referral arrangements so that if someone's specialist need is better met by another agency or organisation, then we work with them. I mean, to give you a very clear example of that, Headspace is hugely specialist, focused on young people's mental health. And there are, of course, times that we will work with Headspace, we'll work with Lifeline, Reach Out, Are You OK? And the list goes on. We're also an organisation that focuses on what we think the mental health system should look like, which is a stepped care system. We are not at the acute clinical end where people need medical services, very intensive interventions. What we are seeking to do is to raise community awareness, to foster behaviour change in individuals so people are informed, active, empowered to take care of their own mental health and to support those around them. We are assisting with the development of low intensity services. For example, Beyond Blue's new Access service is now in many parts of the country. It's a non-clinical coaching model for people who are perhaps experiencing some difficulties but do not need a clinical intervention. We do focus on suicide and suicide prevention, as well as anxiety and depression. And we very much have created a new way of working for people who have tried to take their life, who have been hospitalised as a result. And we've created the Way Back support service. So when people are discharged, there is a service that engages with them, because the people most at risk of suicide are people who have tried to take their lives, and they are most at risk in the critical 3 months afterwards. And so we work with them in those 3 months. So we don't seek to cover the field. We're very clear about where we've got a comparative advantage, a way of working that is very effective, but we've always got to interplay with others. And we're very active in advocating for a reform agenda in Australia around mental health, because if you imagine the system of that series of steps, stepped care, at the moment, a number of those steps are missing. So we've got to build that so people can get the right support at the right time.
I think we have made significant progress as a community in the way in which we talk about mental health and the way in which we understand mental health. I think even, from a decade ago, there is a far greater awareness of the different types of mental health conditions that people can experience and how prevalent they may be. We also have laws in this state and nationally that protect against discrimination on the basis of mental health. If you are an employer, or if you're a provider of goods and services, or if you're a school, you can't treat someone unfavourably because of a disability or because of their mental health condition. But we still hear stories at the Victorian Commission, thousands of stories every year from people who get in touch with us, who tell us about the exclusion and the poor treatment that they have experienced as a result of their mental health condition. Last year, we did an investigation into the travel insurance industry, where we looked at insurers who had refused insurance, either people taking out insurance or refusing their claims on the basis of a mental health condition. And we found that there had been about 300,000 unlawful acts of discrimination in that industry. And we know it's not just confined to travel insurers, but even though I think some organisations are getting better at promoting and taking care of their employees and their employees' mental health, there's still a pretty stubborn stigma that attaches itself to people who are living or experiencing mental health conditions. Perhaps a stigma that sees that as a weakness or some sort of burden, rather than seeing those people as very resilient and insightful. And I wanted to understand from your perspective what you see the impacts of discrimination on mental health to be, and how we can now perhaps use this as an opportunity to really combat and to dig into some of that stigma that still attaches itself around mental health.
Yes, your analysis, I think, is absolutely right, that we've come a long way, but we've still got much further to go. So we should celebrate the fact we've come a long way. And I actually think during the days of the pandemic, we've seen that. I mean, if this pandemic had happened 10 or 20 years ago, I don't believe that governments, community, media, families would have been talking about mental health in lockstep as they talked about physical health and making sure that you were as safe as you could be from the virus. From the very first days that we've been talking about COVID-19, people have been working through and having an active dialogue around mental health. So I think, that's good. And governments have responded with a national mental health plan associated with the pandemic, government, state and federal, and that's to be applauded too. But that doesn't mean that everything is resolved. I think there's layers here that we need to think our way through. I think most people now would not articulate the view that, mental health shouldn't be spoken about, it should be hidden away. Most people probably know enough now to not simply say to themselves, really it's just about individual weakness. They could fix all of this if they just pulled their socks up. I think people are a bit beyond that. Still some people with those attitudes, but I think mostly people are beyond that. They realise that mental health conditions are prevalent, that they can happen to anyone. And when you get people talking, most people in their circle of family, friends, work colleagues can talk about someone that they know who's had to work their way through mental ill health. So the levels of stigma that I think we need to focus on now are self-stigma and sort of structural stigma. And by self-stigma, I think it is possible for people who would honestly say, I wouldn't think less of anybody if they told me that they had a mental health condition, for that person to think inside their head, but if I had one, I wouldn't tell anybody. I'd be worried about how other people would react. And that holds people back from seeking support and getting in contact with services. So that self-stigma is there. And then there's the structural factors that you point to. I mean, it is one thing to say, I wouldn't look down on someone who told me they had a mental health condition. It's another thing to say, and I'd happily give them a job in my business, or I'd happily be on a work team with them. Or it would be fine with me if they moved in next door, if they worked at my child's school, and the list goes on. And then there's, in that sort of more structural end, the very pointed legal issues that you highlighted. Beyond Blue was very pleased to work with the Victorian Commission on the travel insurance issue, and it was just such a blatant example that travel insurance policies were being sold that purported to say you could have no recourse to your travel insurance even when you'd fully paid for it if the reason for having the recourse was related to mental health, whereas if anything went wrong with your physical health, then you would be able to rely on your travel insurance policy. So I still think that there are pockets of that kind of discrimination that we need to find and address.
Are there cohorts in our community that suffer more from the stigma than others? Are women, for example, more likely to reach out and seek assistance than men? Does your data tell us anything about that?
Yes, it does. And it does tell us that women are more likely to engage in help-seeking behaviours. They're more likely to talk about mental health. I think particularly for mid-range to older men, the stereotype of the, stoic, strong, silent man who gets through everything. He's not much given to sitting around and talking about his feelings. He just gets on with it. I think that cultural stereotype is still with us and does hold some men back from seeking help. We have tried to address that in a variety of ways. We think one way that's been particularly effective has been our partnership with our elite sporting codes, things like the AFL and NRL, because, those very physically fit, men that many of those men who feel those stereotypes, they probably follow the footy. They'd be very knowledgeable about players. This would be one of their pleasures in life. And if a male football player says, I've got an issue with mental health and is prepared to talk about it, then I think that can unlock a lot of doors for us.
Julia, in addition to being a really staunch mental health advocate, you're also an incredible advocate for gender equality. And there's a few lines from your recent book that have really resonated with me, one of which was, when we approach gender equality, we should do it with mindful determination, but also with great impatience. And I thought that both recognises that we're in it for the long haul, but actually sometimes the pace of change is still too slow. And when I reminded my 10-year-old daughter this morning that I was interviewing you today, she told me first of all to be really nice to you, which I assured her that I would. And then we talked about how you are Australia's only female Prime Minister. And she, with the sort of incisive cut through of youth, said, who made up these dumb rules anyway? That girls can't play sports or be prime ministers. And I thought, well, that's a very good question. And I was struck by this idea that the next generation is the answer, except that we know that the passing of seasons doesn't necessarily translate into greater equality unless people are continuing to advocate for it. And we also know that the rules are really hard to change, whether they're social rules or rules that make up organisations or rules that shape political life. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you have learnt to change the rules, but also what is your hope for the future of women and girls?
That's a fantastic question. Who made up these dumb rules anyway? I love it. That's a question I
was trying to come up with an explanation, but I was flat-footed on it.
One of those questions that would have you going, just let me think about that. I'll come back to it. I guess in many ways, the answer to your daughter's question is over many, many generations, everybody contributed to making up these dumb rules and creating the stereotypes and structural biases that are still with us. And it takes all of us to unwind them as a result. Once again, this is an area where I think we should say a hell of a lot of progress has been made. I've seen that across my lifetime, but I am impatient for more. And I am particularly impatient when organisations like the World Economic Forum tell us that for women to have full political equality around the world will take another 100 years. Full economic equality will take 200 years. I mean, far, far, far too long to wait. I mean, how does change happen? Well, ultimately, it happens because people want it to. And because hearts and minds, individuals have been persuaded, groups have been persuaded, organisations have been persuaded to act. And then it happens in the most impactful way if people have got together the evidence about what brings the most change. And part of the work that I do now, particularly the work I do with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, is making sure that the evidence about what truly works for change is there at depth and available to all. In my, sort of lifetime journey, my time in politics, I've seen a number of things have a very big impact. When the Australian Labor Party adopted its affirmative action rules in the sort of early 1990s, that's made a huge impact. It's the reason that when you look around the country now at Labor teams in parliaments, that they're routinely round about half-half. And that's a sea change from where we were in the early 1990s, when at the time the number of women on the parliamentary Labor team in the federal parliament was at 14%, 14%. So, structural interventions like that can make a very big difference. But we also need to put alongside the structural interventions measures to address stereotypes. Because the structural interventions in and of themselves don't clear away the stereotypes. And once again, this starts with shining a light on it. It's good that there is more and more evidence coming to the fore about those, stereotypes, those whispered voices in the back of our brain that tell us what we should assume about men and what we should assume about women. And the more we can get those out of the back of our brain and into the conversation and talk them through and realise how ridiculous they are and then put them aside, the more openly and fairly we will look at everybody's contribution and the more inclusive we will be. Gender, of course, isn't the only grounds on which people are discriminated against. There are many others, but gender is the one that I spend most of my time working on now.
It's interesting that conversation about stereotypes. In the last few years, the Commission has worked a great deal with emergency services. So we've done a lot of work with Victoria Police. We're about to go and do some work with Ambulance Victoria. We've done some work with Victoria Fire Services, all incredibly important organisations where the stereotype of what it means to be a good cop or a paramedic or a fiery is pretty strong. And I think your analysis that we can't just tell people that those stereotypes don't stand or are not modern or truthful anymore. We actually have to unpick the evidence for it. And that's an interesting, I think, parallel to the way in which we have relied on scientific data and scientific reasoning in the last 8 months to make decisions about what laws and processes we have to put in place during a pandemic. We actually need to approach gender equality, sometimes I think with the same sort of rigour and evidence base for that structural and that broader change that you're talking about. What are you most hopeful about for the future of women and girls?
I do just want to, I'll certainly tell you what I'm hopeful about, but I do want to just pick up that evidence point because it is so important. And people would think in the area of stereotypes that it's a hard thing to get evidence in. But just to take one example we refer to in the book, there is plenty of evidence now about how people assume that a woman who has power or is seeking power, that she is likely to be not a nice person, a nasty person, because it is offending against the stereotypes that you have in the back of your brain. Women are supposed to be caring and empathetic. So if you see a woman who has or is wanting to have power, you go, she must have given up on the caring and the empathy. She's probably not very likable. And this stereotype was hugely in play against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 US election. And people were trying to puzzle through, are they people saying that about her because she's a woman, or are they saying it about her because she's Hillary? You know, what is it? Whereas the more evidence that's come out about that stereotype, the clearer people have got on it. So when Vice President Harris was in the election contest and people were calling her nasty or unlikable, immediately people were reporting and saying, hang on, that's a sexist stereotype. That's not actually about the woman at the centre of this. This is about how we see gender. And so in 4 years, evidence and research has helped deal with a stereotype that's so common about women leaders. So the evidence is critical. What am I hopeful for? I'm hopeful, number one, that some of the things that we're taking with us from this pandemic period, including the best of virtual work, can help create workplaces that are more gender equal. Now, not everybody can work virtually, but I think for those occupations that can, this technology gives us the prospect of more family-friendly, more gender equal, more diverse workplaces. So I'm optimistic about that. I'm optimistic about the coming generation, maybe not as young as your daughter, but the coming generation of young women who make my level of impatience look trivial. They are knowing, they are informed, and they're basically not going to take it anymore. And I think that they are going to be a generation that brings huge change. I think that is true of young women, but I think it's also true of young men who are increasingly knowing about these issues too, and who are saying, I don't want my life defined by some old-fashioned worldview about what it is to be a man. So I think this is going to be a hugely impactful up-and-coming generation.
I am going to invite, we've got some questions, they're the end of my formal questions, but we've had some people send some questions into us from the audience. And so I'm going to invite Martin back in for these questions. I'll just wait until his audio and mic is up.
Hey there, I'm back. What a great conversation. Enjoyed every minute.
Thanks, Martin. One of the questions that has been sent through to us for you and Julia is about the Human Rights Framework, and it's an apt question because it is International Human Rights Day. And the question is about one of the criticisms of the Human Rights Framework, in that it's focused on the individual, and that can set up a tension between an individual's human rights being in conflict with someone else's human rights. And there's also been a critique that there's too much focus on self-care, for example, when it comes to mental health, rather than thinking about groups of people and social systems. So the question is there a way that we can have conversations about individuals' rights and people's well-being that also encourage concern and consideration for others and really for the greater good?
Do you want me to kick off, Kristen, and then see what does that work for you?
Yeah, why don't you kick off?
Well, look, firstly, I think those are exactly the sort of conversations that we've got to have. And certainly this year for RMIT, we sort of had to put them front and center, because I think 2020 has reminded us of the importance of both the individual, but also the world, the systems, the community around us, in which we as individuals are embedded. And so we, through the whole of 2020, have really been encouraging conversations for people to look out for themselves, but also to look out for each other. And we've been really consistent and clear about not just how people can get access to the support services that we've got, but how they might need to flex to the individual needs and experiences that they have. And I'm sure everybody watching this has had somebody reach out to them this year and give a random act of kindness, where they just reached out and said, we care, or how are you? And I've got to tell you, for me, in some of the darkest moments, those have been the things that have really carried it through. And so in addition to all of the dedicated support services we've offered our students and staff, we've really been actively encouraging those conversations around mutual support and wellness. But it's also really provoked us to think about, how do you do that in the context of when we're largely in digital exchanges? And one of the things that we've discovered, and from my own background of scholarship, I knew it to be true, but that idea of social exchange and social support through technology is just as important, if not more important, as the content or the messages that you're trying to get across. For years now, I've talked about and developed sort of social learning constructs so that you could combine the best of education with the best of social through digital forums. And we know they work best when learners are part of peer groups or can exchange together and work together rather than just simply consuming. So I guess sort of in summary, Kristen, what I've learned this year is that sort of community resilience is a social good. That would be the first thing, and we have to foster that well-being and recovery are strengthened when they're socially supported. And then finally, looking forward, we need to develop the way we design our health systems, our education systems, our digital infrastructure and services in ways that encourage and foster sort of that sense of shared support and reciprocity, sort of reciprocal exchange, so that it doesn't put all the burden back on the individual to sort of have to sort it for themselves. And so those are just some thoughts from me, Kristen.
Thanks so much, Martin. And Julia, do you hear this refrain around self-care and prioritising yourself at the expense of others, or do you see it differently?
I certainly do hear that refrain, and I am always fairly careful to say to people, look for the evidence when you're thinking about your own mental health. Unfortunately, if we look across the vast sweep of what calls itself the wellness industry, there are many things that are not evidence-based. And so look for the evidence about how you will manage your own mental health. But I think when we hear that and the onus being on the individual, it really stands in the face of what we know fosters good mental health overall. And so I really think that this is a much more collective endeavour. So if you were looking at the social determinants that affect mental wellness or mental ill health, and at Beyond Blue, we very much ask people to cite their thinking about mental health in a social determinants analysis. We know that hugely protective factors in relation to people's mental health are having a safe and secure place to live, having a purpose in life. Now, for many people, that purpose is work, something that you get up for in the morning and that you go and do. Others find their purpose in some other way. People who are taking time off work to care for children, people who are of post-work age and have found a new lease on life, becoming involved in a local community group or whatever, but a sense of purpose and then a sense of connection. And that connection can be with family and friends. It can be with like-minded individuals. We snapshot that as, a date on Saturday night. And, it's a sort of silly way of putting it, but we're trying to make the point that if you've got a safe place to live, a sense of purpose, and you've got ways of connecting with individuals, then that hugely protective. Now, making sure that everyone in our society has those things requires a collective endeavour about how we organise our society, not an individual self-care endeavour. And so we've got to work together to get that right. And so if you map that over the, rights framework, you could say the rights framework speaks into that, because of course it does talk about things like the right to shelter, but it speaks into it in a way that has got ramifications for mental health.
Continuing on that theme, one of the messages of 2020, which started with the fires, has been that we're all in this together. And to some extent we have been, but we've also seen evidence of real polarization that exists in our society. And it seems also rising number of people who are buying into conspiracy theories. If you have school children, you'll certainly hear about them in the schoolyard. So I learned from my kids that you can catch COVID-19 off the internet. So there's all sorts of things going on out there, but with the hollowing out of media and the way that social media tells us what to think, what to hear, it seems like this is a growing problem, and it has the real potential and is already, I think, creating division and conflict within society and sometimes even within families. I'm interested to hear from both of you what we can do about this.
Yeah, first of all, to start off at a personal level, I think the bushfires and COVID have really brought out some of the best characteristics of Australians in terms of us truly having a collective view about how to tackle adversity. I mean, I'm incredibly proud of my fellow Victorians for the way, you know, we really did do it pretty tough there for a while, but we did it to sort of support and help each other. So before I sort of go to the dark side of sort of these dividing forces, it did make me proud and does make me proud to be an Australian when in a time like this and working through this. But that being said, those forces driving polarization, Kristen, that you mentioned, they really do just continue to challenge our collective progress. And luckily, though, I do think there's lots of ways that we can work together, that theme of working together, to counter some of it. So it's about, I think, supporting accuracy and rigor in our media. It's about, and Julia's spoken about this, fostering evidence and expertise in public discussion and government decision making. It's about developing sort of shared spaces and ways to exchange ideas and conversation, which encourage people with different perspectives and experiences to understand each other and treat each other with dignity and respect. You know, there's been some recent election results around the world, and your initial reaction to that is often dismay that so many people could vote in a particular direction. But I think you have to have the courage to walk out of your own discourse and listen to what are the underlying motivations for people to want to express an opinion or act. But I think, to your question, more and more we can just allow ourselves to live in our own little self-reinforcing bubble and never are provoked to stray out of our bubble to get the counterpoints, to get the challenge, to develop critical thinking. And so, you know, one of the things I was thinking about was, Julia, I'm sure you are proud of the fact that when you were Deputy Prime Minister, you helped establish the conversation along with RMIT and some other universities. And I think it's a wonderful example of innovation in media and knowledge sharing, which aims for that level of transparency and informed exchange across our community. Another one that I'm really proud of is our RMIT ABC Fact Check that's been undertaking really excellent work to bring both clarity to specific claims made in the media, but also to identify high quality resources to enrich public conversations. And I think it's a space that universities have to continue to lean into, because it's why we're created, really, you know, to help inform people and debates, to be places where real ideas and real evidence can actually be aired and discussed, but also where we can sort of discover connection rather than division in our society. And I'd like to think it's one of the primary responsibilities of a university is to bring some rigor and divergent opinion into our society and community, Kristen.
And on that theme, thanks, Martin. On that theme, Julia, do you see leadership or politics becoming closer to the middle or further apart? Do you see a division and a conflict, or do you see a coming together?
That's a great question, and I am happy to answer it and build on a few things that Martin said. I think we should be very proud as Australians too about how we faced the pandemic. And one of the things that we should be proud of that Australians have built over generations, and obviously the Labor Party played a role in this, but that our healthcare system is an equitable and accessible one. Is it perfect? No, it's not. But the great institutions of free public hospitals, of Medicare, have meant that Australians have been able to come into a crisis like this, knowing that they would get healthcare if they needed it. And so many people around the world are not in those circumstances, even in nations that have high income levels by the standards of the world. There is not equitable healthcare. I'm obviously thinking of the US there. So, you know, the building of our healthcare system has been an enormous act of social solidarity that has stood us in good stead. What should we learn from that and think about from the future? I think that there are some other features of Australia that help us come together in difficult times, and more generally. I am a huge advocate of our voting system, our compulsory registration and voting system, because it means our democracy is ultimately about everyone, and it's not about turning out votes from highly motivated groups who may not have the same view as society overall. If you ask yourself the question, why is it that year after year after year in the United States they've been unable to get reasonable gun laws? Partly there's a cultural thing that is there coming from American history, but it's also because with their voluntary voting system, highly motivated minorities like those mobilised by the National Rifle Association can have an outsized role in public policy. Our compulsory voting system tends to mean that our politics coheres around the middle, and that's a good thing. Now, that doesn't mean that every division or argument in politics is a bad thing. You know, the best ideas come out of dialogue, discussion, debate, even debate that can be a fairly heated one. That's part of how we democratically test ideas, and that's a good thing. But, you know, in our politics, I think that democratic testing then periodically goes through elections to the people, and we sort it out with our compulsory voting system. In terms of the, you know, conspiracy theories and all the rest of it, I'd look at that through the frame of, you know, people are often attracted to those sorts of things because they are angry about some circumstance in their life. And anger often is the product of disappointed hope. People thought their lives were going to be better than this. And we need to take that with us into the post-COVID economic reconstruction. If, you know, it's one thing to say we're all in this together, and at one level, of course, that's true because anybody can get the virus, anybody can become unwell with it. But in terms of the economic impact, they are highly differential. Some people have been basically untouched. Some people have lost everything, lost jobs, lost small businesses that they and their families have spent maybe generations building up. And unless we as a society respond to that through practical policies, but also understanding that as we're having these conversations, we're not simply glibly glossing over that. We're all in this together. We're actually listening and hearing from people who have lost so much and are feeling very angry and disconcerted about it. Unless we do that, I think it will feed into a different form of fractiousness, and it will be around the conspiracy theories and the like.
Mm. And just finally, a final question, and I'll direct it to you, Julia. We've touched on this briefly, but it's certainly been a defining feature of the pandemic that women have perhaps carried the extra load, and whether that's through increased unemployment in women-dominated industries or home education responsibilities. We've also seen an increase in reported domestic violence, and the extreme workload and risk, as you mentioned, for health and social care workers. as we rebuild and as we try and imagine what individual and collective lives, how they can be bettered, what would you like to see us as a society do to make sure that women are more equal?
I would like us, as we recover from the pandemic and design the shape of the new normal, to do that every step of the way with gender diversity and inclusion generally as a design principle. So not adopt any policy measure, whether that's a government, a business, a public sector, a civil society organisation, a community, not adopt any measure without asking and answering the question, will this be good for diversity and inclusion? And if we did that every step of the way as we shape what the new normal is going to be, I think we could end up with a far more equal, fair society. And we would look back on 2020 as a horrible time with loss of life around the world, with illness, with economic shocks and loss, with people locked up in various ways around the world, often for extended periods of time. But we could also look back on it as a time that we made a decision to do better for the future.
I can't think of a better way to end our conversation on International Human Rights Day than that every decision and every thought that we have now is around, will this be good for equality? Will this bring us closer together? So I'm so grateful to you, Julia Gillard, for joining in this conversation with us today. It's been a privilege to speak to you. I think when I saw you become the Prime Minister back in the cafe at Victoria Legal Aid, I didn't imagine that we'd have this opportunity. So it's been a real joy for me personally. And I thank you too, Martin, for your involvement today and for the support of RMIT University across this whole week that we hold each year, Human Rights Week. And to all of you who have joined us online today, we had over 700 people register for this event, which I think goes to the calibre of the speakers, but also I think goes to that sense of we do want to hear conversations, we do want to contemplate these things, and we do want to invest in hope for the future. So on behalf of the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission and RMIT's Social Innovation Hub, we wish you all the best for the rest of the year. We wish you a better year next year, and to stay safe and well, and to take care of each other. Thank you very much.